Hi, I'm Ariane, and welcome to Change Nation. If you're struggling with some sort of a health diagnosis or maybe some sort of emotional issue, this interview is definitely for you. We are very lucky today to have a world-renowned physician, David Simon, with us. He is an expert really in the mind, body, health, and emotional connection between disease. Amongst many other things, he's had several books be published in dozens of languages. He also runs Deepak Chopra's Center. And we're thrilled to have him today to really talk about what is the connection between emotion, health, disease. I know a lot of us are struggling with that today. So David, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to our show.
Well, thank you for having me.
David, for people who don't know really about your background or how you came to be this world-renowned physician, tell us a little bit about how it all started for you and then also how you came to write this book that we're going to talk about.
Sure. Well, in my culture of origin, it was determined that a fetus became a human being when it graduated from medical school. So I knew from a very early age that I was going to be a doctor. I studied anthropology in my undergraduate days and actually focused on shamanism. In between undergraduate and medical school, I became a yoga and meditation teacher. So when I started medical school, I had a certain perspective on what being a doctor was about. I knew about transcendence, about witch doctors. But when I entered medical school, I realized that my worldview was very different from the prevailing one. And it took me a while to figure it out. But basically, the conventional medical model says that people, human beings, are biochemical bags, molecular machines. So if there's something wrong with a person, you manipulate the molecules. If you're having heartburn, it's not because you're stressed out at work, it's because you're producing too many hydrochloric acid molecules, so here's a proton pump inhibitor. If you're having trouble sleeping at night, it's not because you're worried about your kids, you're not producing enough GABA, so here's some Ambien or Restoril. And if you're depressed, it's not because your core relationships are not loving or you haven't figured out your meaning and purpose in life, it's because you're not producing enough serotonin, so here's some Prozac or Zoloft. So that's the model that prevails, but really from before I started medical school, I always suspected that there was a story behind illness and that if we were willing to reveal that story, we could affect people on multiple levels, improving their psychological and their physical health.
So give us some examples for people right off the bat of what you see the emotion connected to a certain condition. So whether it's obesity, whether it's depression, whether it's migraines, whether it's irritable bowel syndrome. Is there a connection? Like, can you really sort of go, anger equals this symptom or heartbreak equals this symptom?
Well, all those conditions that you mentioned, and probably every condition that a person can think about, has an emotional component to it. And sometimes the emotional component is core, and I think things like irritable bowel syndrome or fibromyalgia, which is a chronic pain disorder, or chronic fatigue. These are all almost certainly core emotional problems that express themselves physically. Then there are, really hardcore physical problems, often genetic, certain types of cancer and autoimmune diseases, but still we know that the emotional component has a profound effect on that physical condition. In fact, there's just a really interesting and kind of sad study that was published where they looked at people admitted to a Kaiser hospital in San Diego with an autoimmune disease. These included everything from multiple sclerosis to rheumatoid arthritis to actually certain types of diabetes, which are autoimmune diseases. And then they asked these people to fill out a detailed questionnaire about their childhood. And it turns out that if you had a traumatic childhood, meaning if you were the subject of emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, if your parents were violent towards each other, if there was drug abuse in the household, or if there was a divorce at an early age, for each one of these episodes, you had a 20% higher risk of being admitted with one of these immune disorders. So there's this very close connection between what's happening in our minds, in our emotional hearts, the neurochemistry, and really the rest of the physiology.
Can we get really specific? So if we go through some of the more classic conditions that people are experiencing right now, can you sort of say, obesity, I really identify it with this, migraines, I identify it with this?
Well, there's common themes, but there's also very specific stories. So, obesity is a common problem in our society, and the reason that it is so common is that when a person's life otherwise seems out of control. Controlling what you put in through your mouth gives you some sense of ability to influence your environment. So it's quite common with people who have had, say, child sexual abuse to have obesity or eating disorders when they get older, because they didn't feel control of their boundaries, and that manifests later on as needing to be excessive in their way of monitoring their boundaries. So I'd like to think it was as simple as, say, Louise Hay said, that for every disorder there's a specific emotional pattern. It hasn't been my experience that it's that simple, but clearly there's always a story, and if you allow people to access that story and tell that story, that's actually the first stage of healing.
Do you see disease in the body show up from people who are chronically dishonest, who lie all the time? Have you been able to see a connection between lying and disease?
That's a really interesting question.
I just find this whole country is about dishonesty and lack of character and lack of integrity.
Right, and the reason for that is that from a very early age, children were punished for telling the truth. So if you hit your baseball through the window and people say, who hit that baseball? If you actually admit it, you're the one who got punished. It really carries through our entire society. So if you commit a crime, your lawyers immediately tell you, plead not guilty and fight it, because in the end you'll have less of a punishment than if you come out right at the beginning and say, okay, I admitted I did something wrong. And it's particularly true in childhood, where every family wants to project this image of everything being perfect, even though most families are fairly dysfunctional. And so anytime a child tries to reach out to describe what's going on, they get punished. So I would say that since everybody's really good at lying, because it's become a life protective mechanism, you could say that perhaps on some level not acknowledging the deep truth in people's lives is the source of all illness. In fact, what I've come to realize is that when you recognize pretty early that telling the truth had consequences, then you began to tell a story around that. And then pretty soon you were telling a story to protect the story, and then another story to protect the story. And for so many people, their whole life is this kind of never-ending story to not deal with the authentic truth. I mean, we see it right now in what's being revealed with Michael Jackson, that the whole story on some level is just one lie being covered up with another story, being covered up with another story.
Is there a connection between people staying in a bad relationship, a bad job, and having that manifest in their physical body?
Yes, and I think that men and women express it differently. So when men stay in something bad, it's usually because they feel responsible, but they also sense that no one is acknowledging their contribution. And that often expresses itself as a heart attack. It's very common for a man in their 50s to have a heart attack, and when you say, why did you get this heart attack, they're not going to tell you, oh, it's because my LDL cholesterol was too high, or my blood pressure was elevated. They're going to say, oh, because I've been in a job that wasn't rewarding me, or I had a family that wasn't appreciating me. So I think that those disorders often reflect this underlying sense of lack of appreciation. And with women, I think that the lack of appreciation shows up in a variety of different forms. One is in the digestive system. So when a woman can't stomach something anymore, rather than actually expressing it, it'll often translate into irritable bowel. Another thing that'll happen is when a woman can't handle the setting healthy boundaries in a relationship, that'll manifest as chronic pain. Literally the old story of, not tonight, dear, I have a headache or a backache or a neck ache or some other reason which gives them the space to protect themselves. So again, it's not always that simple, but everybody knows in their own mind, or everyone has a story in their own mind, what is it that led to this problem. And when you give people the safety to start telling that story, it's amazing how quickly their whole psychology can change, and literally their physiology will change.
David, fascinating. We're going to take a really quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk specifically about your book. I know there's some steps that people can take to really look at their own healing. We'll be right back.